Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, Book 2, written among the Quadi on the River Gran. 1. Say to yourself, at the start of the day, I shall meet with meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable people. They are subject to all these defects, because they have no knowledge of good and bad. But I, who have observed the nature of the good, and seen that it is the right, and of the bad, and seen that it is the wrong, and of the wrongdoer himself, and seen that his nature is akin to my own, not because he is of the same blood and seed, but because he shares as I do in mind and thus in a portion of the divine, I then can neither be harmed by these people, nor become angry with one who is akin to me, nor can I hate him, for we have come into being to work together, like feet, hands, eyelids, or the 2 rows of teeth in our upper and lower jaws. To work against one another is therefore contrary to nature, and to be angry with another person and turn away from him is surely to walk against him. 2. Whatever it is that I am is flesh and a bit of breath and the ruling centre. Put away your books, distract yourself with them no longer. That is not permissible, but rather, as though you were now on the verge of death, despise the flesh, just blood and bones and a mesh of interwoven nerves, veins, and arteries. Consider too what kind of a thing breath is, a stream of air, and not always the same, but at each moment expelled and drawn back in again. The third part of you, then, is the ruling centre. Look at the matter in this way. You are an old man. No longer allow this part of you to act as a slave. No longer allow it to be tugged this way and that like a puppet by each unsociable impulse. No longer allow it to be discontented with its present lot or flinch from what will fall to it in the future. 3. Providence permeates the work of the gods, and the works of fortune are not disassociated from nature, but intertwined and interwoven by all that is ordered by Providence. Everything flows from there, but necessity is implicated too, and the benefit of the whole universe of which you are a part. Now for every part of nature, the good is that which universal nature brings, and which serves to sustain that nature, and the universe is sustained not merely by the changes of the elements, but also by the changes of the bodies compounded from them. Let these doctrines, if that is what they are, be enough for you. As for your first thirst for books, be done with it, so that you may not die with complaints on your lips, but with a truly cheerful mind and grateful to the gods with all your heart. 4. Remember how long you have been deferring these things, and how many times you have been granted further grace by the gods, and yet have failed to make use of it. But it is now high time that you realized what kind of a universe this is of which you form a part, and from what governor of that universe you exist as an emanation, and that your time here is strictly limited, and, unless you make use of it to clear the fog from your mind, the moment will be gone, as you are gone, and never be yours again. 5. At every hour devote yourself in a resolute spirit, as befits a Roman and a man, to fulfilling the task in hand with a scrupulous and unaffected dignity, and with love for others, and independence, and justice, and grant yourself a respite from all other preoccupations. And this you will achieve if you perform every action as though it were your last, free from all lack of purpose and wilful deviation from the rule of reason, and free from duplicity, self-love, and dissatisfaction with what is allotted to you. You see how few are the things that a person needs to master if he is to live a tranquil and God-fearing life, for the gods themselves will demand nothing more from one who observes these precepts. 6. You ill-treat yourself. You ill-treat yourself, O my soul, and no occasion will be left for you to do yourself due honor. For the life of every one of us lasts but a moment, and yours is almost done, and yet you have no respect for yourself, and allow your happiness to depend on what passes in the souls of other people. 7. Are you distracted in any way by what happens to you from outside? Then give yourself some free time to learn something new and worthwhile, and stop wandering about aimlessly. But after that, you must also guard against going astray in a second way. For equally foolish are those who become weary of life as a result of their activities, and have no aim to which they can direct every impulse and indeed every impression. 8. Rarely is a person seen to be in a bad way because he has failed to attend to what is happening in someone else's soul, but those who fail to pay careful attention to the motions of their own souls are bound to be in a wretched state. 9. Always keep the following points in mind: what the nature of the whole is, and what my own nature is, and how my nature is related to that of the whole, and what kind of a part it is of what kind of a whole, and that no one can prevent you, in all what you do and say, from always being in accord with that nature of which you are a part. Theophrastus speaks like a true philosopher when he says, this is number 10, in his comparison of faults, for one may make such a comparison when speaking in a more or less popular sense, that faults committed through appetite are graver than those committed through anger. For when a person loses his temper, he seems to turn his back on reason with a kind of pain and unconscious wringing of the heart. But when he offends through appetite and is overpowered by pleasure, he somehow seems more licentious and more unmanly in his wrongdoing. Theophrastus was right then, and was speaking as befits a philosopher, when he maintained that wrongdoing associated with pleasure calls for harsher condemnation than that associated with pain. Generally speaking, in the latter case the offender is more like a person who has his first been injured by another, and has been driven by pain to lose his temper, while in the former he has been impelled to do wrong as a result of his own inclination being carried away by appetite to act as he does. 11. Let your every action, word and thought be those of one who could depart from life at any moment. But taking your leave of the human race is nothing to be feared, if the gods exist, for they would not involve you in anything bad. If, on the other hand, they do not exist, or if they do not concern themselves with human affairs, why should I care to go on living in a world devoid of gods or devoid of providence? But they do exist, and they do show concern for human affairs, and they have placed it wholly within the power of human beings never to fall into genuine evils. And besides, if anything were bad for us, they would have taken measures too to ensure that everyone would have it in his power not to fall victim to it. But if something does not make a person worse in himself, how could it make his life worse? It cannot be thought that universal nature, either out of ignorance or because, while knowing of it, she lacked the power to guard against it or put it right, would have allowed such a state of affairs to persist. She would never, through lack of power or skill, have committed such a grave fault as to allow good and evil to happen to good people and bad alike without distinction. Now death and life, fame and obscurity, wealth and poverty, happen to good and bad in equal measure, being neither right nor wrong in themselves, and so it follows that they are neither good nor bad. 12. How swiftly all things vanish away, both the bodies themselves in the universe and the memories of them in time, and of what a nature are all those things that we perceive, especially the things that entice us with the promise of pleasure, or frighten us with the thought of pain, or are proclaimed with an empty mind. How cheap it all is, how despicable, sordid, corruptible, dead. This must be left to our faculty of reason to determine, and consider too who those people are whose opinions and voices confer renown and ignominy, and what it means to die, and that if one considers death in isolation, stripping away by rational analysis all the false impressions that cluster around it, one will no longer consider it to be anything other than a process of nature, and if somebody is frightened of a process of nature, he is no more than a child, and death indeed is not only a process of nature, but also beneficial to her. Consider too how a human being makes contact with God, and through what part of himself, and how that part of him must be disposed if he is to do so. 13. There is nothing more pitiable than the person who makes the circuit of everything, as the poet says, searches into the depths of the earth, and tries to read the secrets of his neighbour's soul, yet fails to perceive that it is enough to hold fast to the guardian spirit within him, and serve it single-mindedly. And this service is to keep it pure from passion and irresponsibility, and dissatisfaction with anything that comes from gods or human beings. For what comes from the gods is worthy of reverence because of their goodness, and what comes from human beings should be dear to us because we share a common nature, although sometimes, in a sense, it deserves our pity too, because of their ignorance of good and evil, an infirmity no less grave than that which deprives us of the power to distinguish black from white. 14. Even if you were to live for 3,000 years or 10 times as long, you should still remember this, that no one loses any life other than the one that he is living, nor does he live any life other than the one that he loses, so the shortest life and the longest amount to the same. For the present is equal for all, and what is passing must be equal also, so what can be lost is shown to be nothing more than a moment, and no one could lose either the past or the future, for how could he be deprived of what he does not possess? So always bear in mind these 2 points. Firstly, that all things are alike in nature from all eternity and recur in cycles, and it therefore makes no difference whether one sees the same spectacle for 100 years, or 200, or for time everlasting. And secondly, that the longest lived and the earliest to die suffer an equal loss, for it is solely of the present moment that each will be deprived, if it is really the case that this is all he has, and a person cannot lose what he does not have. 15. Everything is what you suppose it to be, for the words that were addressed to the cynic Monimus are clear enough, and clear too the value of that saying, if one accepts its inner meaning so far as it is true. 16. The human soul does violence to itself, above all when it becomes, so far as it can, an abscess and a sort of morbid outgrowth on the universe. For to set your mind against anything that happens is to set yourself apart from nature, which subsumes the nature of all other things. Again, our soul does violence to itself when it turns away from any other person, or moves against him with the intention of causing him harm, as is the case with those who lose their temper, and thirdly, when it is overcome by pleasure or pain, and fourthly, when it acts as a part, and says or does anything under false pretenses, and fifthly, when failing to direct any act or impulse of its own towards a definite good, it embarks on anything whatever in an aimless and ill-considered manner, whereas even the most insignificant action should be performed with reference to an end, and the end for all rational creatures is this, to conform to the reason and law of the most venerable of cities and constitutions. 17. In human life, the time of our existence is a point, our substance a flux, our senses dull, the fabric of our entire body subject to corruption, our soul ever restless, our destiny beyond divining, and our fame precarious. In a word, all that belongs to the body is a stream in flow, all that belongs to the soul, mere dream and delusion, and our life is a war, a brief stay in a foreign land, and our fame thereafter oblivion. So what can serve as our escort and guide? One thing, and one thing alone, philosophy, and that consists in keeping the guardian spirit within us inviolate and free from harm, and ever superior to pleasure and pain, and ensuring that it does nothing at random, and nothing with false intent or pretense, and that it is not dependent on another's doing or not doing some particular thing. Furthermore, that it welcomes whatever happens to it, and is allotted to it, as issuing from the source from which it took its origin. As issuing from the source from which it too took its origin, and above all, that it awaits death with a cheerful mind, as being nothing other than the releasing of the elements from which every living creature is compounded. Now, if for the elements themselves it is nothing terrible to be constantly changing from one to another, why should we fear the change and dissolution of them all? For this is in accordance with nature, and nothing can be bad that accords with nature.